Howdy everyone. I wanted to make a video for the end of the year where I would just unload every single video idea that I couldn't turn into their own standalone video, whether that's because I didn't have time, or the energy, or even enough to talk about, and put them all here. But then I realised that the video would just be me making a bunch of varyingly salient points with no coherent structure around them, no narrative, and they'd just be a bunch of padding with no spine holding them together. And then I decided to make it anyway. So without further ado, I present to you a series of 3 to 8 minute rants about specific things that I had a random urge to talk about at some point in the year. I might make it an annual thing, I might not, but either way, welcome to a bunch of half-baked ideas I kind of want to talk about but aren't long enough to dedicate an entire video to, with no coherent narrative all the way through, kind of like Aesop's Fables but for content ideas. Or half-baked ideas for short.
Xenophobic warrior princess molested by my Uncle Sam, is that incest?
If anyone says the phrase linguistic utility in front of me ever again, I'm going to bleach their pancreas. You don't mean linguistic utility, you mean linguistic efficiency, and you just don't want to learn more words to help affirm new people's identities. People have been having bad opinions and justifying them poorly since well before the internet. But the internet, arguably one of the greatest inventions of our time, has at least one flaw in that it's allowed people to do it in front of my face. The latest brand of this is reactionaries talking about neopronouns and Xenogenders. The 2014 discourse that should have died almost a decade ago is back and it's taking place in leftist circles. Circles of people who think that he, him, she, her, and they, them trans people are super hecking valid, but people who don't identify within those three labels are not. This line of thinking comes from an attachment to, and a refusal to erase, the gender binary. People see non-binary people as exceptions to the rule, where the gender binary they grew up believing in is still upheld, and every non-binary person is just trying to fit between them and assimilate. They want to imagine that every person can fit on a line from male to female, and non-binary people fit in a specific point between them, or just off to the side out of view. And this is wrong for many reasons, partly because gender interacts with so many things that we experience in our lives. For example, let's picture a kid. This kid has thin, wispy blonde hair and a favourite colour of dark green. They like trucks, dinosaurs, and robots. The kid that you pictured is probably like a boy, right? Even though I didn't specify that, that's where our assumptions went because of what we heard about what they like. Those interests will be affirmed or inhibited, encouraged or discouraged, roughly in accordance with that kid's perceived gender. And, since everyone's different, kids will internalize those experiences slightly differently. Maybe that kid only ends up with a surface level understanding of gender, typical of most cis people who never discover empathy or go through a period of earnest self-reflection. Maybe that kid ends up going on a journey of self-discovery and finds out that they want to explore the world. Maybe they find out that they're non-binary. Maybe their personal experience with gender is inseparable from the experiences within their formative years, and they do some soul-searching, some scouring of some online spaces, meet some super cool people, and then find out that identifying with something like, I don't know, rocks, is something that resonates with them like a lot of things haven't in the past. Especially the gendered identifiers like man, woman, boy, girl, etc. And then that person finds some DGG shithead who tells them that their identity is harming the trans community, even though the community is what helped that person on the way to better understanding themselves. But I think that they do this for a specific reason. You know that type of auction with two people where both of you are bidding for $100, and then you both keep bidding because it's the most reasonable thing to do, but spoiler alert, the catch is that any amount bid by both bidders is taken into the pot, even if you don't win. And if you're bidding $99 and the other person has bid $100, you bidding $101 means that you're no longer getting any profit, but you're still not losing $99 for nothing, and so your net loss is only $1. But then the other person has the same problem. He either loses $100 or bids $102 and only loses $2, and so on until you either cut your losses once you realize the shtick, or you bet your house and life savings on $100. But the quote logically consistent thing to do in your situation is always to keep bidding, because if your next bid is the winning bid, you lose $100 fewer. I bring this up because I think that people who reject Xenogenders are in a similar situation. They've grown attached in a way to this gender binary because it helps them understand the world, and it interacts with so many things they've experienced in their lives, and they're unwilling to cut their losses because they've already invested so much into it. Their entire evaluation of the world, of gender, has been based upon this gender binary being front and center. Their cis experience, or their binary experience, is inseparable from the society that they live in, and they don't even realize it. They can't imagine that someone's experience with gender can be so radically different from theirs. So they have a starting point of only male and female, and they've had that affirmed throughout their whole childhood and adolescence. They've been able to fit their experience with the world onto that framework. Then they came into some tension when they discovered non-binary identities, which challenged their assumptions of an all-encompassing gender binary. So they either still make attack helicopter jokes to this day, or they change their ideas on gender to accommodate their new surroundings, and think of all non-binary people as like third positionists. And now, when people who have xenogenders and use neopronouns come into their periphery, who reject their notions of a binary altogether, that doesn't fit into their worldview. And they can't just cut their losses. They've invested too much into the auction to back out now. It's just not profitable for them to stop. And it never will be again. So they don't.
I was never taught what laws there are. I was never taught what laws there are.
I don't know if 3 months ago is too long ago in the internet archives, but people got a bit mad about things on the internet when Demon Mama and Hans of Harkia had a bit of a heated debate about anarchism and the concept of mandatory schooling. It's all a bit weird, and I don't want to dwell on internet drama this long after it's faded into obscurity. That wouldn't be very good of me, I think, especially since I don't know anyone involved with the drama too intimately. But everyone and their mother has come out with their takes about this drama, adding nuance to the discussion, coming up with alternative perspectives, and trying to find a midpoint between the two positions, and then Hans asserting that that midpoint is where he was coming from after all. Meet me in the middle, says the unjust man. You take a step forward, he takes a step back. Meet me in the middle, says the unjust man. For a timeline of events, Hans and Demon Mama have a wee debate about how to make schooling better. Hans was coming into this debate with the assertion that some form of education is good and necessary in order to function in society and live a life that's as free as possible. And as a result, we should ensure that children have no way of going without that education, using state power if necessary. Demon Mama was coming into this debate with the assertion that instead, we should limit the ways in which we convince children to go to school. Coercion is a bad thing, and we should aim to minimize that coercion as much as we possibly can. And naturally, as blood sports tend to do, this debate came to a very heated end, and it's kind of sparked a bit of discourse, and Hans's subsequent downfall into DGG communities. But Hans, like an absolute Chad, went on a whole tirade on Twitter and within his community over the next day or so, where he'd get people who were mad at him on twitter.com to debate him, in kind of a Riley Grace Rochon kind of way, all while not realizing that a lot of the conversations he's bringing up are a lot more nuanced than 3 yes or no questions. It got so bad to the point where honestly it just felt like he was bringing up a line of people he could bully in front of his community. Fast forward a day or two, a bunch of creators have made their own videos on this topic, adding their own nuances, coming out as #enlightened centrists on this issue, where they agree that schools should be improved and that government coercion is bad, but not quite putting those two together in the same way that Demon Mama was trying to assert. So I thought I'd try to do that in this video, try to come to a defense of this whole conversation, and try to leave this mess of a discourse a little bit better than I found it. And that's not particularly hard. In this current world, some form of literacy, numerical and cognitive capabilities are pretty much necessary to survive independently in any capacity. If you don't have any way of gaining those skills, or you're impeded enough from getting those skills, then you're going to be somewhat removed from the functioning world. That's not really something that's up for debate. That'll probably maybe change in the future when we have enough robots to do all the dirty work, and we don't need that form of education, and we can just vibe it all out. But that's not currently the world we live in. But let's also dive into a little bit of child psychology. Children who aren't yet disillusioned with the world due to trauma or self-awareness want to learn. Learning and sociability are the only 2 sections of the human condition that I feel comfortable saying are innate to humans. Teach a monkey to make a spear and it'll have a spear. Teach a human to make a spear, they'll show the rest of their tribe. It's why young kids like to touch hot stoves. They just want to know things. They want to know how it feels to touch the pretty orange dancing lights, and they don't know that they'll cry for an hour afterwards. So if we want to have people educated enough to perform in this world, we should probably find a way to capitalize on that curiosity. Enter public schooling. There is a social system that exists to try and channel that childhood interest in the world around them into making upstanding adults who trade hours of helpful labor for precious value coin. So surely people within that social system, who all have bundles of empathy and compassion for their local community and the members in it, should care a lot about that system and what goes into it, right? Wrong. That's not true. School sucks. It's well known by now. A lot of kids would rather stay at home and not learn than go to school. So the question becomes, how do you get those kids to go to school? You make it mandatory, of course, and you enforce that by issuing fines to parents whose kids don't go to school for some reason, even if that school is prime suspect within the school-to-prison pipeline, genocides native populations, and fields teachers who are abusive towards students because sometimes they just can't afford to replace them. However, mandatory schooling comes with a lot of problems. Firstly, that the priority shouldn't be to force kids to go to school. It should instead be making school better enough that students aren't traumatized by school or fed into a cycle of crime by their school or literally genocided by their school to the point where they really don't want to go. Secondly, the evidence that mandatory schooling actually reduces truancy rates is pretty tenuous. There is insufficient evidence that truancy rates actually go down enough as a result of stricter punitive policy towards kids who don't go to school. And pretending that there's some hypothetical kid that mandatory school would help does not make that point. And thirdly, the question that Hans got a bit too hung up on is that even if that evidence is confirmed to be a lot more there, maybe that shouldn't be the only priority of school. I've said school so much it's hard to even recognize the word at this point. Because if kids are, again, getting traumatized and or genocided by their school, and they want to not be traumatized and or genocided, they should probably be allowed to not do that without their parents being fined up to 3 months worth of potentially life-saving rent money for not showing up to school just because that kid is crying themselves to sleep, even if that kid would otherwise not get an education. Another solution to this is maybe, just because someone doesn't get an education, maybe they shouldn't be left on the street to starve? Maybe we should have some form of social safety net that allows people to not go homeless just because they were suffering from severe school-induced trauma during the time that they were being given an education. I think that threat being placed upon people within our world, which we all have bundles of empathy and compassion towards supporting, isn't an overly good thing. I'm gonna say it, coercion is bad. With a caveat though, some things are worse than coercion. I think that coercing a child out of drinking out of a pretty bottle because it's bleach is a moral thing to do, and is a lot better than letting them die. Two things can be bad at the same time. This doesn't mean though that coercing a child to not drink something isn't usually a bad coercive thing. Just that in this case it is justified because the child dying is a worse outcome. If we're talking about in an ideal world though, where the schooling system was 100% effective in teaching kids about anything they'd need to know and improving their overall quality of life, wasn't racist or genocidal or abusive, and was universally extremely enjoyable, then would forcing someone into that system be a good thing? I don't know. I think that by that point, we'll probably have progressed enough as a society that our education would be almost entirely optional. And if that child wanted to stay at home and play video games all day, well, higher quality of life involves freedom. And if ignorance is bliss, then Godspeed. I've made a few videos about Vaush. Vaush? I've made a few videos about Vaush and this type of thing that at the time got a decent bit of traction, for my 100 subscribers at the time at least. Probably because stirring up drama gets clicks or something. But since then, my opinions have matured a little bit, and looking back on these videos, I've removed them from my channel in order to replace them with this short section, partly because I disagree somewhat with what I said in that video, or at least how I presented it, but also because my editing in it was a bit bad, to be honest. For a general trigger warning though, I'm gonna have opinions and stuff that might possibly alienate you, but I hope you come into this with at least some level of charitability, and at the very least think about things from my perspective, even if you end up disagreeing with me. And if you enjoy your time here, like and subscribe. Also, these things currently on screen. But this video is about Wokescolds. Wokescold is such a terminally online term, it feels weird even saying it out loud. This is something that creators like Vaush in particular have talked about a few times on their channels, and he's definitely done his part in popularizing the word, although since then I've heard he's stopped doing it so much, and he's subsequently become a lot better and more palatable regarding progressive issues as a result. Something I still stand by to this day though, is that I think creators such as Vaush, Xanderhal, Shu, ContraPoint's Demon Mama are overall fine. Just because I don't watch these creators very much anymore, it doesn't mean that I don't acknowledge the core claim of these channels. The existence of debate bros on the internet does appeal to a demographic who would otherwise be unreachable by videos like this one, and that is something that's good to do. What can I say, I love watching fascists squeal. Vaush blowing I hypocrite out of the water holds a special place in my heart. I think that's enough charitability for the time being, now onto the video. Wokescold is a term that gets thrown around a little bit, usually in the same sentence as purity testing. There's a lot of things that are associated with it, and it's kind of hard to define in one. It's just cancel culture for leftists. It insinuates that there's some little groups of hyper-woke leftists who use wokeness as a way to purity test people they don't like out of the true left, and harass people online for kicks, I guess. Also, they apparently use it to deplatform helpful leftists because feeling powerful is good or something. And obviously there's going to be people like that somewhere in the world. In a sea of billions, you can imagine almost any type of person at all, and they're probably going to exist. That being said, if people see big public figures legitimizing the narrative of a nebulous someone targeting them, sabotaging their side in the culture war, that's going to make people believe it's a lot worse than maybe it is. And sooner or later you find yourself with a group of paranoid people watching other people validate their fears. And that can become a marketable demographic. It's something that a few creators have found themselves doing because that's what gets people watching their content gotta keep up to date in the cancel culture war. Vaush derangement syndrome. But here's the thing, calling someone a shit-headed bigot isn't cancellation. Sometimes people are just shit-headed bigots. And saying XYZ did a transphobic thing doesn't mean that XYZ is a shitty, irredeemable person who doesn't deserve to have a platform on the internet. Sometimes it just means stop. Whenever insert leftist figure gets cancelled, and it's always anti-Wokescolds getting mad at one tweet which gets liked by like 30 people, they'll often make a fuss about rehabilitative justice. And rehabilitative justice is not only demonstrably better for punishing crimes, but also a lot more effective in terms of relapse rates. That being said, if you've managed to frame the people criticizing you for something as an outgroup that you can blame for everything, then that can very much undermine that benefit. Also, it's maybe the fourth step in a system we're not even on step one of. If justice needs to be enacted, we first need to acknowledge that something crappy has actually happened. Secondly, we need to remove the perpetrator. Thirdly, we need to provide a path of recovery for the victim. And then, and only then, the type of justice, which we can agree should be some form of rehabilitation, is decided and enacted. I'm not one to pull relentlessly from current events, but what's happened to Calvin Gara, apart from the fact that he's still doing harm and hasn't learned anything other than what to say to mask his beliefs, is a decent example. All the crappy things he did came to light, then he took a break from the internet, removing the perpetrator. Then most of the victims of his harassment came forward and are starting to be accepted within inclusive communities, and RGR is attempting, very unsuccessfully unfortunately, to rehabilitate him to the point where he knows the gravity of the situation that he caused by spouting his beliefs to his YouTube channel. But the issue here, I think, is that if the person being rehabilitated is an online figure, then that rehabilitation needs to be done offline, away from the platform the creator was using. See removal of perpetrator. But I don't know if that's even something that's possible to do alone. Storm Ryan disappeared for a month behind the scenes, only to run an entire podcast with Brennan, as well as a bunch of other non-binary creators. So without that secure safety net, it's bound to be, at best, super precarious, and at worst, actively harmful. Because sometimes you just can't afford to do that, because you're financially dependent upon streaming every day. So you have to find some way to justify not taking time off to self-reflect. Enter the grift. I use the word grift very neutrally, by the way. Sometimes you've got to put food on the table and you've got to pretend to believe something in order to not get fired from your job. Leftists in retail or other minimum wage jobs will probably understand this feeling. But sometimes it's profitable to pretend that cancel culture for leftists is real and worth getting mad about to your audience who will eat it up. And when people call you out, you have someone to blame for your misfortunes. So a grift can be either very understandable or just very weird. As for where a few prominent anti-Wokescolds fit on that scale, who am I to say?
Has no good handle on consent, his parents are the 1%.
There's not much that I like more in this world than laughing at Paul Joseph Watson. He looks like you plugged the GigaChat face into a Football Manager face generator. His voice sounds like a machine learning AI which learned what an English accent is from Americans making fun of English accents. He looks like a duck impersonating Alex Jones. His face looks like he doesn't shower, only washes his hair. He tweets the same shower thought 5 times on Twitter and brags about it. That one's true and is actually gonna come up later. He looks like Will Bessert's short, sad pervert dad. He looks like the type of guy who used to make pickup artist content, but it didn't pick up traction because he didn't have the natural charisma. Paul Joseph Watson is like a randomly generated face, but if it was generated from other randomly generated faces. Unfortunately, the rest of this video isn't going to be me roasting Paul Joseph Watson and his DSL. I might still make that video if any single person tells me that they want this, but instead this is about one topic that Paul brings up all the time. It's something that he's pretty proud of, in fact, as we'll come to realize later on. And that is the phrase, conservatism is the new counterculture. This is something he's self-admittedly tweeted 5 separate times in his video with the same title.
I tweeted, conservatism is the new counterculture. I tweeted it again, and again, and again, and again.
Now, to the average person, tweeting the exact same epic own 5 separate times, and making an entire video about how epically you totally owned some weirdos on Twitter, might seem like you're at best gloating too much about this one sentence you came up with in the shower, and at worst like you're trying to convince everyone else that you're cool, even though you look like a white Ben Shapiro. But lucky for us, we can rest easy knowing that that's not actually the case. Paul hasn't actually tweeted this thing 5 separate times. Because he's actually tweeted it 43 times, and he also has another video 2 years earlier with that exact same name. For something that Paul is evidently super proud about, it's worth asking the question, is conservatism really the new counterculture? First off, it's important to note that right versus left isn't a pendulum, unless of course you consider the 2 parties in any first-past-the-post democratic country as the left and the right, as opposed to what left and right actually mean. Instead, we just swing further and further left over time, while the right tries to swing all the way back and reverse all progress in one fell swoop by electing a fascist when they feel they're losing, only to fail 60% of the time and try again 20 years later. There are conflicting narratives within online conservative spheres about whether the general public is really on their side. The liberal left, which are now the same apparently, are either A, not as big and imposing as they think they are and everyone agrees with them because conservatives are actually the majority, they're just being bullied into silence by the cancel culture SJWs. Or they're B, actually in a majority control of the media and now everybody right of centre has to stand up and fight with violence for their own God-given right to always have their way in a, checks notes by the way, don't read checks notes out loud, democratic society. And they have to do so by starting a badass punk-style counterculture movement, while also misunderstanding the fundamental philosophy of what punk even is. Punk has always been a way for those who are oppressed to find a voice and a social safety net in the cracks between the culture and the people. It's called a counterculture for a reason. It's not only not mainstream, but also directly countering the boundaries of societal acceptance just by virtue of existing. Conservatives, who usually want to keep society as it is, do not fit into that movement. This is why punk has almost always been staunchly queer, leftist, anarchist, pro-worker, explicitly supportive of people left out by society, and therefore it's anti-conservative by design. But that doesn't matter to them because conservatives have a persecution fetish. Conservatives want to be oppressed so bad they'll literally wish it into existence. If you've ever had an opinion left of center about any social thing, you will inevitably get dogpiled by people asking the same thing. What about cis, straight, able-bodied white men? Who's catering to us? You're the real racist, sexist, heterophobe. They want so bad for you to actually be trying to take their rights away from them, and they don't know that that's projection because they've bought into this lie that their own thoughts and feelings are the objective truth. It's like they watched Fight Club and thought, hey, did you see that irredeemable character that's a satire of toxic masculinity who joins a club based on violence just to feel like a man? Let's make him our mascot. They don't even know to understand that no, they shouldn't actually want that, because no amount of being able to dress like a badass makes up for the absolute exhaustion that comes with people thinking you're crazy for stating basic truths and thinking people should have equal rights. They just want the aesthetic of being oppressed. Why exactly they want this is unclear. Maybe they just want the fact that they feel shitty to mean something. Maybe they see the world collapsing around them and want to find something to blame for it that isn't themselves. Which would maybe explain their obsession with the Joker. Maybe they want to appeal to young people who would otherwise join progressive counterculture movements. Maybe they want an explanation for why they're sad all the time. I don't know. The exact reason why they're LARPing as a conservative punk is irrelevant. What's important is, when conservatives, or authoritarians in particular, feel less in control of their country, they don't adapt. Instead, they tighten their grip and try to go back in any way necessary. It's why they got a lot more openly fascist when Trump lost the election, and they literally tried to do an entire coup. It's the same entitlement that they feel every time. They lose ground, they get mad, and they fight. They keep fighting and fighting until what they had slips through their fingers. And then they let go, cut their losses, and try again. But they can't fight all the time. They've never had to adapt to a life where they fight all the time. They've always been part of upper-class society. They've never been oppressed. They've never been attacked for being a cis straight white guy. They don't have the mental energy to actually fight for what they believe in. So instead they have to believe that they're winning and they've always been winning. It's a walking contradiction, as are most conservative talking points. They're simultaneously losing and therefore have to fight, and also winning in an absolute landslide. But they have to believe both of them at the same time, or at least the one that's the most advantageous or the most comfortable in any given moment. Also, for the record, punk already exists, and it's overwhelmingly queer and progressive and has been for like 50 years. Queer, trans, and non-white people have been creating culture since forever, and white cis women with blue eyes and blonde hair just aren't entering punk circles in order to submit to an authoritative, domineering man and start a family with 2.1 white kids. That's just not what punk is for. Punk is overwhelmingly gay, anarchist, anti-conservative, anti-authority of any kind. Any conservative trying to enter the circle isn't going to find much by way of companionship in there. So what do? They try to create their own bigoted version of it, which is worse in every way. If it exists, the alt-right will try and use it in the culture war. From milk to hairstyles to frogs to features of the English language, people on the far right have either tried to co-opt or demonize everything they can even think of in order to appear like the most reasonable side in any discussion tangentially related to politics. It's not always going to work, but if you're a hack fraud movement trying to maintain a dwindling audience, then it's always worth it to try. Conservatism is dying, and it's dying fast. The younger, healthier generations are getting steadily more progressive, while the traditional conservative voter base is dying off, whether it's from cancer, old age, or COVID. Young conservatives are a passing fad, and they're growing out of their childhood echo chambers at an ever-increasing rate. Maybe as they fade into obscurity, conservatism will die out completely. Maybe it won't, but maybe conservatism will just stay as a passing fad and become a phase for edgy teenagers to eventually grow out of. Maybe that's what they mean when they say conservatism is the new punk rock. So yeah, that's all that. There were a few video ideas I ended up not including here, some because I ended up deleting them, some because they just sucked as ideas, and some that I still plan on making sometime in the future. Either way, feel free to like and subscribe if you enjoyed. YouTube actually lets me know which videos people subscribe from, so if you're not subscribed and you want to see more videos like this one, then feel free to subscribe. It's free and you can always unsubscribe later. Anyway, stay safe, stay spicy, and as always, have a good one.